You know that feeling when you suddenly become aware that you're aware? That strange, almost vertigo-inducing moment when consciousness catches itself in the act of being conscious? Well, congratulations, you've just stumbled into the most magnificent trap that evolution ever set for itself. Because here's what nobody wants to tell you. The very thing that makes you human, this precious self-awareness we're all so proud of, is also the source of every psychological suffering you've ever experienced. Think about it. Animals don't lie awake at night questioning their purpose. Trees don't have existential crises. Only you, with your beautiful, terrible gift of self-reflection, have managed to create a mind that can torture itself simply by thinking about thinking. And the delicious irony, the more aware you become of this trap, the deeper into it you fall. Now, let me ask you something rather unsettling. Who is it that's listening to these words right now? And more importantly, who is it that's aware of the one who's listening? You see, we've gotten ourselves into the most delightful predicament. The mind, in its infinite cleverness, has convinced itself that it can step outside of itself and observe itself objectively. It's rather like trying to bite your own teeth, isn't it? But here's where it gets beautifully absurd. Every time you try to catch yourself being aware, you create yet another layer of awareness watching the watcher. It's an infinite regression that would make any mathematician weep with joy and despair simultaneously. I remember when this first struck me with full force. I was sitting in meditation, trying desperately to observe my thoughts, when suddenly I realized who is doing the observing, and then, even more disturbing, who is asking who is doing the observing. And then, who is aware of the one asking who is asking? You can drive yourself completely mad this way, and many people do. It's like standing between two mirrors and watching your reflection disappear into infinity. Each image contains all the others, yet none of them is the real you. The tragedy is that we've been taught to believe that somewhere in this hall of mirrors is the true observer, the real self, the authentic you. But what if I told you that the very search for this observer is what creates the illusion that it exists? What if the observer is nothing more than a grammatical convenience, like saying it's raining when there's no it that rains? But we can't stop looking, can we? It's as if consciousness came equipped with this compulsive need to understand itself, like a flashlight trying to illuminate its own beam. And the more we look, the more we create this feeling of separation between the looker and what's being looked at. Yet here's the beautiful paradox. The very thing that seems to separate you from life, this self-aware observer, is actually life itself watching. But the moment we say that, the mind jumps in and asks, but who is it that knows this? And off we go again, tumbling down the rabbit hole of infinite regression. Now, isn't it fascinating how we've all become convinced that the mind can know itself? It's rather like expecting a knife to cut itself, or a fire to burn itself. Yet here we are, millions of us, engaged in the most serious pursuit of self-knowledge, using the very thing we're trying to understand as the instrument of understanding. The mind, you see, is absolutely brilliant at knowing things outside itself. It can measure the distance to the stars, split atoms, compose symphonies, but ask it to know itself, and watch what happens. It immediately splits itself into the knower and the known, the subject and the object, the thinker and the thought. I've watched people spend decades in therapy, meditation, self-analysis, all trying to figure themselves out. And what do they discover? More thoughts about thoughts, more feelings about feelings, more ideas about who they think they are. It's like trying to catch your shadow by running faster. But here's what's really happening behind this comedy of errors. The mind has become convinced that it's separate from what it observes. It thinks there's a me in here and a world out there, and somehow this me can step back and get an objective view of the whole situation. What a marvelous illusion we've created. We've convinced ourselves that consciousness is like a spotlight that can be turned around to illuminate itself. But consciousness isn't a thing that can be observed. It's the very capacity for observation itself. It's rather like asking what color is the lens through which you see colors. The lens doesn't have a color, It's what makes color possible. Similarly, consciousness doesn't have characteristics that can be observed. It's what makes observation possible. Yet we persist in this impossible task, don't we? We read books about consciousness, attend workshops on self-awareness, practice techniques for observing the mind, all the while using the mind to observe the mind, like trying to see our own eyes without a mirror. And the beautiful joke is that what we're looking for is what's doing the looking. What we're trying to know is what makes knowing possible. What we're seeking to understand is understanding itself. But don't think I'm suggesting you should stop this search. Oh no, that would spoil the whole game. The very futility of the search is what eventually reveals its own absurdity. It's only by pursuing the impossible task of self-knowledge to its logical conclusion that you discover there was never anyone there to know anything in the first place. You know, there's something quite sinister about this whole watching business. We've all become little surveillance experts of our own minds, haven't we? Constantly monitoring our thoughts, judging our emotions, critiquing our reactions, and we call this progress. We call this self-awareness. But what we've actually created is the most sophisticated form of self-imprisonment ever devised. Because the moment you split yourself into the watcher and the watched, you've created a fundamental conflict within your own being. One part of you is always trying to improve, control, or understand the other part. Think about it for a moment. When you meditate, who is it that's trying to quiet the mind? And who is the mind that's supposed to be quieted? When you practice mindfulness, who is being mindful of whom? It's the most elaborate game of hide and seek you could imagine, except you're hiding from yourself. I've seen people torture themselves for years with this internal division. They sit in meditation, and there's the meditator watching the thoughts, judging whether they're doing it right, getting frustrated when the mind wanders, celebrating when they achieve some temporary clarity. But they never stop to ask, who is this meditator who's doing all this watching and judging? The tragedy is that this very division between watcher and watched is what creates the problem it's trying to solve. You see, when you're not self-conscious, when you're completely absorbed in dancing or making love or listening to music, there is no watcher separate from the experience. There's just dancing, loving, listening. But the moment self-awareness kicks in, suddenly there's a you having the experience, watching the experience, evaluating the experience. And just like that, you've fallen out of paradise and into the peculiar purgatory of self-consciousness. It's rather like what happens when you become aware of your breathing. Normally, breathing just happens, effortlessly, naturally, perfectly. But the moment you start watching your breath, trying to control it, improve it, or understand it, something goes terribly wrong. The natural rhythm gets disturbed by the very attention you're paying to it. And yet, here's the paradox within the paradox. Without this capacity for self-awareness, you couldn't even recognize that there's a problem. You need consciousness to become conscious of consciousness. You need the watcher to realize that the watching is the problem. You need self-awareness to discover the terrible burden of being self-aware. It's the most delicious trap imaginable. The very thing that could liberate you from the prison of self-consciousness is self-consciousness itself, but not the kind that divides and analyzes and judges. Rather, the kind that sees through its own game, that recognizes its own absurdity, that laughs at its own seriousness. Because when you really see what's happening, when awareness becomes aware of its own activities without trying to change them, something rather extraordinary occurs. The watcher and the watched reveal themselves to be the same process, like the front and back of a single sheet of paper. And in that recognition, the whole elaborate structure of self-improvement and self-monitoring simply collapses into laughter. Let me tell you something that might disturb you profoundly. You are the only creature on this planet cursed with the knowledge that you exist. Think about that for a moment. Every other living thing simply lives. Birds fly, fish swim, flowers bloom, all without the slightest self-consciousness about their activities. A cat doesn't spend sleepless nights wondering if it's being an authentic cat. A tree doesn't have anxiety attacks about whether it's growing in the right direction. Only you, magnificent and miserable human being, have been granted the dubious privilege of being aware that you are aware. And what have we done with this extraordinary gift? We've turned it into the source of every neurosis, every existential crisis, every midnight panic about the meaning of life. We've taken the very thing that makes us most remarkable and used it to make ourselves thoroughly miserable. You see, consciousness came with a hidden price tag that nobody bothered to read. The moment you become aware of your existence, you simultaneously become aware of your mortality. The instant you recognize yourself as a separate being, you create the possibility of loneliness. The second you can observe your thoughts, you can judge them, worry about them, try to control them, and so we find ourselves in this peculiar situation where our greatest asset has become our greatest liability. Consciousness, which should be pure celebration, has become contaminated with self-consciousness, which is pure suffering. Awareness, which should be effortless presence, has become complicated with self-awareness, which is effortless anxiety. But here's what I find absolutely fascinating about our predicament. We spend enormous amounts of energy trying to get back to that unconscious state of natural flow that animals and plants never left. We meditate to stop thinking. We practice mindfulness to be present. We do yoga to feel embodied again. We're basically paying money and investing years of effort to temporarily forget that we're self-aware. Isn't that deliciously absurd? The very thing we're trying to achieve through spiritual practice is what every mosquito experiences without effort. Every blade of grass is already in perfect meditation. Every cloud is already practicing mindfulness. Every wave is already in the flow state we're desperately seeking. Yet we can't go back, can we? We can't unknow what we know. We can't become unconscious again. And thank God for that, because as terrible as self-awareness can be, it's also the only thing that makes beauty possible, love meaningful, and jokes funny. You see, a sunset is just electromagnetic radiation until consciousness appreciates it. Music is just vibrations in the air until awareness experiences it as beauty. Love is just chemical reactions until self-awareness recognizes it as love. So here we are, caught between two impossibilities. We can't go back to the unconscious bliss of the animals, and we can't go forward to some superhuman state of pure awareness. We're stuck in this strange middle ground where we're conscious enough to suffer, but not quite conscious enough to transcend the suffering. But perhaps that's exactly where we're supposed to be. Perhaps this terrible gift of self-awareness isn't a cosmic mistake, but a cosmic experiment. Perhaps we're the universe's way of experiencing itself subjectively, of knowing itself from the inside, of becoming aware of its own existence. And if that's true, then our suffering isn't a bug in the system, it's a feature. Our self-consciousness isn't a problem to be solved, it's a mystery to be lived. Our awareness of our awareness isn't a trap to escape, it's a gift to be unwrapped, slowly, carefully, with great tenderness and even greater laughter. Now here's where the whole thing gets truly diabolical. We've taken this terrible gift of self-awareness and convinced ourselves that we can use it to improve ourselves. We've created an entire industry around the idea that the self can fix the self, that consciousness can perfect consciousness, that awareness can optimize awareness. It's the most ingenious trap ever devised, because it uses your own desire for freedom to keep you imprisoned. Every self-help book, every meditation technique, every therapy session promises that if you just work hard enough at being aware of your patterns, you can transcend them. If you just observe your thoughts long enough, you can control them. If you just understand your conditioning deeply enough, you can break free from it. But who is it that's doing all this improving? And who is being improved? You see, the moment you set up this project of self-improvement, you've created a fundamental split within yourself. There's the improver and the improved, the fixer and the broken, the enlightened part and the ignorant part. And this division is precisely what keeps the whole drama going. I've watched people spend decades trying to improve themselves. And what happens? They become very sophisticated prisoners. They can analyze their neuroses with great precision, describe their defense mechanisms in elaborate detail, observe their thought patterns with scientific accuracy. But somehow, the more they know about their prison, the more trapped they feel. Because here's the secret nobody wants to hear. The one who wants to improve is the very one who needs improvement. The seeker is what you're seeking to escape from. The self that's trying to transcend the self is the self that keeps the self in place. It's like trying to lift yourself up by pulling on your own bootstraps. Think about it. When you meditate to become more peaceful, who is it that's not peaceful? When you practice mindfulness to be more present, who is it that's absent? When you work on yourself to become more loving, who is it that's unloving? The very entity that's doing the spiritual work is the entity that believes it needs spiritual work. And so we get caught in this beautiful absurdity where the ego sets up a spiritual project to transcend the ego. The mind creates a meditation practice to go beyond the mind. The self initiates a journey to discover no self. It's like a dog chasing its own tail, except the dog thinks it's engaging in a profound spiritual discipline. But here's what makes it even more maddening. Every once in a while, the whole structure collapses temporarily. You have a moment of genuine spontaneity, real presence, authentic love. And what does the mind do? It immediately analyzes the experience, tries to figure out how it happened, attempts to recreate it, turns it into another technique for improvement. So even your liberation becomes material for your imprisonment. Even your enlightenment becomes something the ego can possess and improve upon. Even your freedom becomes another form of spiritual ambition. It's the most elegant trap imaginable. The beautiful irony is that what you're seeking through all this self-improvement is what you already are when you're not trying to improve. Peace is your natural state when you're not seeking peace. Presence is what's here when you're not trying to be present. Love is what you are when you're not working on being more loving. But don't think I'm suggesting you should stop all your spiritual practices. That would just be another form of spiritual ambition. The ambition to be non-ambitious. No, the real revelation comes when you see through the whole game without needing to quit playing it. When you recognize that the seeker seeking liberation from seeking is just more seeking, and in that recognition, something shifts. Not because you've improved yourself, but because you've stopped believing there was ever anyone there who needed improvement in the first place. This brings us to perhaps the most exquisite joke in the entire cosmic comedy. You are using your mind to escape your mind, using thought to transcend thought, using seeking to find what you're seeking for. It's rather like trying to catch your own shadow by running toward it, or attempting to see your own eyes without a mirror. The spiritual search, you see, is fundamentally based on a case of mistaken identity. You've convinced yourself that you are this small, separate, struggling entity who needs to find God, truth, enlightenment, or whatever you call it. But what if what you're looking for is what's doing the looking? What if what you're seeking to become is what you already are? I remember a delightful story about a fish who spent his entire life desperately searching for water. He swam to the deepest depths, explored every coral reef, consulted with the wisest sea creatures, practiced elaborate underwater meditations, all in pursuit of this mysterious substance called water that everyone kept talking about. The tragedy, of course, is that he was swimming in it the entire time. Now, you might think this is a rather obvious metaphor, but consider how perfectly it describes the spiritual predicament. Your consciousness looking for consciousness, awareness searching for awareness, existence seeking to discover existence. You're using the very thing you're looking for as the instrument of your search. But here's where it gets truly mind-bending. The moment you try to grasp this, to understand it, to make it into some kind of spiritual realization, you've immediately stepped outside of it. The very attempt to possess the insight creates the illusion of someone separate from the insight who could possess it. It's like trying to bite your own teeth, or kiss your own lips, or surprise yourself. The closer you get, the farther away you become. The more you understand, the more mysterious it gets. The harder you seek, the more elusive the finding becomes. And yet, we persist in this impossible quest, don't we? We read spiritual books to discover our true nature, forgetting that our true nature is what's reading the books. We practice meditation to find inner peace, overlooking the fact that the peace we seek is what makes meditation possible. We search for the self, with a capital S, not noticing that what we call the small self is just the self playing hide and seek with itself. The mind, bless it, is absolutely convinced that if it just thinks hard enough, seeks long enough, practices diligently enough, it will eventually stumble upon the truth. But it's rather like expecting to find darkness with a flashlight, or silence by making noise, or stillness through movement. The very instrument of the search prevents the discovery. Here's what I find particularly amusing about our situation. When people have what they call spiritual experiences or moments of awakening, what do they invariably report? They say things like, "I realized I was always already free," or "I saw that what I was seeking was what I already am," or "I discovered that the peace I wanted was already here." In other words, every genuine spiritual insight reveals that there was never actually anything to seek. Every moment of awakening shows that you were never actually asleep. Every discovery of your true nature reveals that you never actually lost it. It's the most absurd situation imaginable, but the beautiful paradox is that you can't not seek. As long as there's a sense of a seeker, seeking will continue. As long as there appears to be someone who could awaken, the dream of awakening will persist. As long as consciousness appears to be divided against itself, the search for unity will go on. So what's the solution? There isn't one, and that's the solution. The very idea that there's a problem to be solved is the problem. The notion that there's something wrong that needs to be fixed is what keeps the fixing going. The belief that you are separate from what you're seeking is what maintains the separation. When this is really seen, not understood, but seen, something rather extraordinary happens. The seeker doesn't find what it's looking for. Instead, it discovers it was never actually there to begin with. And in that discovery, seeking simply exhausts itself like a wave that realizes it was always the ocean. Now we come to perhaps the most maddening aspect of this whole predicament. You see, the very awareness that reveals the futility of seeking creates a new kind of seeking, the seeking to stop seeking. The recognition that control is impossible becomes a new thing to control. The understanding that surrender is necessary becomes a new spiritual technique to master. It's absolutely ingenious how the mind works, isn't it? You realize that trying to control your thoughts only creates more mental agitation, so you try to stop trying to control them. But who is it that's trying to stop trying? You see through the illusion of the controller, so you attempt to surrender the controller. But who is doing the surrendering? I've watched people struggle with this for years. They understand intellectually that letting go is the answer, so they start practicing letting go. They work very hard at not working hard. They make tremendous efforts to be effortless. They use their will to surrender their will. It's like trying to relax by commanding yourself to relax, or attempting to fall asleep by forcing yourself to fall asleep. The beautiful contradiction is that genuine surrender cannot be practiced because any practice of surrender is still an activity of the very entity that needs to surrender. True letting go cannot be achieved because achievement implies someone doing the achieving. Authentic non-control cannot be controlled because control is precisely what needs to cease. And yet, here's the cosmic joke within the joke. The very struggle to surrender eventually exhausts itself. The effort to not effort finally collapses under its own contradiction. The attempt to let go of letting go eventually lets go of itself. It's rather like a wave trying to stop being wet, or fire trying to become cool. The futility becomes so apparent that the whole enterprise simply drops away. But don't think this happens through some kind of spiritual accomplishment. No, it's more like what happens when you finally stop trying to remember someone's name that's right on the tip of your tongue. The moment you genuinely give up trying to remember, the name appears by itself. Not because you surrendered correctly, but because the very structure of trying finally collapsed from its own impossibility. You see, what we call surrender isn't actually something that anyone does. It's what's revealed when the illusion of someone who could surrender is seen through. It's not a state you achieve. It's what's always already here when you stop trying to achieve states. It's not something you practice. It's what you are when you stop practicing being someone else. Think about what happens in those rare moments when you're completely absorbed in something. Dancing, making love, listening to music, watching a sunset. In those moments, is there a controller trying to control the experience? Is there a surrenderer working at surrendering? Or is there simply dancing, loving, listening, watching, without any separate self trying to manage the process. This is what I mean by the dance of control and surrender. It's not that you learn to surrender instead of controlling. It's that you see through the entire illusion that there was ever anyone there who could control or surrender in the first place. The controller and the surrenderer are revealed to be equally fictional characters in the same impossible drama. But here's what makes this recognition so difficult to integrate. The moment you see it clearly, the mind immediately wants to make it into a new philosophy, a better way of living, an improved spiritual approach. It wants to control the insight about the futility of control. It wants to surrender in the right way. It wants to achieve the state of non-achievement. And so the dance continues, but now with a kind of cosmic humor. You see the absurdity of your situation without necessarily being able to step outside of it. You recognize the futility of your seeking without being able to stop seeking. You understand the impossibility of control without gaining control over the understanding. This is actually a much more mature position than trying to escape the paradox. It's the difference between fighting the current and learning to swim with it, even when it's carrying you in circles. Because eventually, if you stay with the impossibility long enough, something shifts, not through your effort, but through the sheer exhaustion of effort, not through your surrender, but through the collapse of the idea that there's someone who could surrender. And in that collapse, what's revealed is not some special spiritual state, but the most ordinary thing imaginable. Life living itself, consciousness being conscious, existence existing, all without any separate self, trying to manage the process. It's so simple that the mind can't grasp it, so obvious that we overlook it, so ordinary that we think it must be something else. Now, let me tell you about one of the most magnificent mistakes in the history of human thought. Poor Descartes, sitting by his fire 3 centuries ago, trying to find one thing he could know with absolute certainty. And what did he come up with? Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. It sounds so reasonable, so logical, so perfectly obvious. After all, here I am thinking, and if I'm thinking, then clearly I must exist, mustn't I? But what Descartes didn't notice, and what we've been forgetting ever since, is that he had already assumed the very thing he was trying to prove. You see, hidden in that little word I is the entire problem of self-consciousness. What is this I that thinks? Where does it come from? Who or what is it that observes the thinking and concludes, I think? Descartes simply took for granted that there was an I there to do the thinking, when that's precisely what needs to be questioned. It's rather like saying, I walk, therefore my legs exist, and then concluding that you've proven the existence of the walker. But who is this I that possesses legs? What is this mysterious entity that claims ownership of the walking? The more you look for this I, the more elusive it becomes. Here's what I find so deliciously ironic about Descartes' revelation. In his quest for absolute certainty, he created the most uncertain thing imaginable, the thinking subject. He turned consciousness, which is the most obvious and immediate aspect of existence, into a problem that has puzzled philosophers for centuries. He made awareness into something mysterious, when it's the only thing that's never actually absent from any experience. Think about it this way. Right now, there are thoughts appearing in awareness, aren't there? But where is this thinker of thoughts that Descartes was so certain about? Can you find an entity separate from the thoughts that's producing them? Can you locate a subject apart from the experience that's having the experience? What you'll discover, if you look carefully, is that there are thoughts, but no separate thinker. There's awareness, but no separate awarer. There's experiencing, but no separate experiencer. The I that Descartes was so certain about is more like a grammatical habit than an actual entity. It's rather like saying it's raining when there's no it that rains, there's just raining happening. Or saying the wind blows when there's no wind separate from the blowing, there's just blowing occurring. Similarly, instead of I think, it would be more accurate to say thinking is happening or thoughts are appearing in awareness. But here's where Descartes' mistake becomes truly problematic. By positing this separate thinking subject, he created the entire modern predicament of consciousness being divided against itself. He made it seem as if there's a mind in here and a world out there, with the mind somehow mysteriously connected to or separate from the world it perceives. And so we inherit this impossible situation where consciousness becomes a problem to be solved rather than simply what we are. We try to figure out how the mind relates to reality, forgetting that mind and reality are not two different things. We wonder how the subject can know the object, overlooking the fact that subject and object are abstractions from the seamless flow of experiencing. The beautiful irony is that what Descartes was actually discovering, without realizing it, was not the existence of a thinking self, but the existence of existence itself. Not the reality of a separate consciousness, but the reality of consciousness as such. What he found was not I am, but simply amness or isness, the sheer fact of being, prior to any division into subject and object. You see, what's absolutely certain is not that there's a thinker of thoughts, but that there's awareness in which thoughts appear and disappear. What's undoubtable is not that there's a separate self having experiences, but that experiencing is happening. What's beyond question is not that consciousness belongs to someone, but that consciousness is present. So perhaps a more accurate version of Descartes' insight would be thinking is happening, therefore existence is. Or even simpler, awareness is present. Therefore reality is. Or most simply of all, this is, therefore this is. But of course, the moment we formulate it like that, it becomes utterly obvious and completely unphilosophical, which is probably why we prefer Descartes' more dramatic version, even though it leads us straight into the labyrinth of self-consciousness, where we've been wandering ever since, trying to figure out who we are and how we can be certain we exist. The joke is that what we're looking for is what's doing the looking. What we're trying to prove exists is what makes proof possible. What we're seeking to understand is understanding itself. And that, my friends, is the beautiful insanity that Descartes accidentally unleashed upon the world. Now we arrive at perhaps the most terrifying revelation that consciousness can have about itself. Because if you follow this investigation of self-awareness to its logical conclusion, you eventually come face to face with a truth that the mind finds absolutely unacceptable. There might not be a self there at all. This is where most people stop looking. This is the edge of the cliff where spiritual seekers often turn back and decide they prefer their familiar suffering to this unfamiliar freedom. Because the ego can handle almost anything. It can even handle being told it's an illusion, as long as it gets to be the one who understands that it's an illusion. But the recognition of no self is different. It's not that there's someone who realizes they don't exist. It's that the someone who might realize something simply isn't there when you look carefully. It's like reaching for your wallet and discovering your pocket is empty. Not just empty of the wallet, but empty of the hand that was reaching for it. I remember the first time this became clear to me, and it was absolutely terrifying, not because something was happening, but because nothing was happening to anyone. There was just experiencing without an experiencer, knowing without a knower, being without anyone who was being. The whole elaborate structure of selfhood that I had taken to be reality revealed itself to be a kind of cosmic ventriloquism. You see, what we call the self is really just a collection of memories, thoughts, sensations, and stories that somehow get bundled together into the feeling of being a separate entity. But when you look for the bundler, the one who's doing the collecting, you can't find anyone there. It's like discovering that there's no projectionist in the movie theater of consciousness, just images appearing on the screen of awareness. This is why enlightenment has traditionally been described as a kind of death, not the death of the body, but the death of the illusion that there was ever anyone separate from life who could live or die. It's the dissolution of the imaginary boundary between the experiencer and the experienced, the knower and the known, the self and the world. And the mind finds this absolutely horrifying. Because if there's no separate self, then who will be responsible for your life? Who will make decisions? Who will remember your past and plan your future? Who will love and be loved? Who will suffer and enjoy? The whole meaning structure that civilization has built around individual responsibility and personal achievement seems to crumble. But here's what's so beautiful about this terror. What you discover on the other side of it is not the absence of life, but life without the burden of having to be someone living it. Not the absence of love, but love without someone who has to possess or be possessed by it. Not the absence of experience, but experience without the weight of someone who has to carry it around. You see, all the things you were afraid would disappear without a self, joy, love, beauty, meaning, are revealed to be more present than ever, because they're no longer filtered through the prism of a separate someone who might lose them, judge them, or try to make them permanent. They simply appear and disappear in the open space of awareness, like clouds in an infinite sky. The paradox is that what you thought was most precious about being human, your individual identity, your unique perspective, your personal story, turns out to be what was preventing you from experiencing what it's actually like to be human. Because being human isn't something that happens to someone, it's something that happens as the universe experiencing itself from a particular point of view. And yet, here's the cosmic joke within the cosmic joke. Even after this recognition, the appearance of being a separate self continues. The ego doesn't disappear like a popped balloon. Instead, it continues to function like a beloved old habit, a familiar character in the ongoing play of consciousness. But now you know it's just a character, not the author of the play. It's rather like watching a movie and suddenly remembering that you're sitting in a theater. The movie doesn't stop, you don't lose interest in the story, but you're no longer completely identified with the characters on screen. You can enjoy the drama without being traumatized by it, laugh at the comedy without thinking you're the comedian, feel moved by the romance without believing you're the lover. So the terror of no self, when you really stay with it instead of running away, reveals itself to be the liberation of no self. The death of who you thought you were turns out to be the birth of what you actually are. And what you actually are is not a someone who has awareness, but awareness itself temporarily pretending to be someone for the sheer joy of the performance. But don't think this means you become enlightened or achieve some special spiritual status. That would just be the ego claiming credit for its own dissolution. No, what's revealed is much more ordinary and much more extraordinary than any spiritual achievement. It's simply what's always been the case, now recognized without anyone there to claim the recognition. And now we come to the final piece of this beautiful, terrible puzzle. Because after all this investigation, after all this seeking and finding and losing and recognizing, what's left? What remains when you've seen through the seeker, understood the understander, and been aware of awareness being aware of itself? Laughter, pure, spontaneous, liberating laughter at the magnificent absurdity of it all. Not the bitter laughter of cynicism or the nervous laughter of embarrassment, but the joyful laughter of recognition, the kind of laughter that bubbles up when you suddenly see the punchline of a joke you've been telling yourself for decades. Because what do you discover when you finally see through the entire elaborate construction of self-consciousness? You discover that you've been like someone frantically searching for their glasses while wearing them, or looking everywhere for a pen while holding it in your hand, or asking for directions while standing exactly where you wanted to go. The cosmic joke is that what you were seeking was what was seeking. What you were trying to find was what was doing the looking. What you were attempting to become was what you've always been. And the funniest part, the very seeking for it is what seemed to hide it. The very effort to find yourself is what created the illusion that you were lost. It's like the old story of the person who spent years traveling the world in search of a precious jewel, only to discover it had been sewn into the lining of their coat the entire time. Except in this case, you weren't just carrying the jewel, you were the jewel searching for yourself. How could you not laugh? You see, this laughter isn't something you decide to do. It's not a spiritual practice or a philosophical position. It arises spontaneously when the sheer absurdity of the human condition becomes suddenly hilariously obvious. When you see that consciousness has been playing the most elaborate game of hide and seek with itself, forgetting that it's both the hider and the seeker. And what's so liberating about this laughter is that it doesn't require you to be anyone special to enjoy it. You don't have to be enlightened to see the humor in seeking enlightenment. You don't have to be free to laugh at your attempts to get free. You don't have to be awakened to find it funny that you think you're asleep. The joke is available to anyone willing to see it. In fact, the more seriously you've taken your spiritual search, the funnier it becomes. All those years of trying to get rid of the ego, when the ego was just consciousness playing dress-up. All that effort to transcend the mind, when the mind is just awareness having thoughts. All that seeking for your true self, when your true self was the awareness in which the seeking appeared. It's rather like discovering that you've been trying to catch your shadow, or that you've been running away from your own feet, or that you've been hiding from yourself behind yourself. How could such an intelligent species get itself into such a beautifully ridiculous predicament? How could consciousness be so clever and so foolish at the same time? But here's what makes this laughter truly transformative. When you can laugh at your seeking, you're no longer completely identified with it. When you can see the humor in your spiritual ambitions, they lose their compulsive grip on you. When you can chuckle at your existential anxiety, it becomes just another wave on the ocean of awareness. This doesn't mean you stop seeking or become spiritually apathetic. It means you seek with lightness instead of heaviness, with playfulness instead of desperation, with curiosity instead of compulsion. You continue the spiritual search, but now you're in on the joke that what you're searching for is what's doing the searching. And perhaps this is the real point of the whole elaborate drama of self-consciousness. Perhaps consciousness divides itself and seeks itself and finds itself and loses itself again just for the pure joy of the game. Perhaps the universe became aware of itself precisely so it could have something to laugh about. Perhaps the whole cosmic comedy of awakening and seeking and suffering and transcending is consciousness's way of entertaining itself. If that's true, then your confusion isn't a problem to be solved, it's part of the entertainment. Your seeking isn't a burden to be dropped, it's part of the play. Your self-consciousness isn't a trap to escape, it's the very thing that makes the cosmic joke possible. So laugh at yourself, my friend. Laugh at your seriousness, your seeking, your suffering, your enlightenment, your confusion, and your clarity. Laugh at the beautiful, terrible gift of being aware that you're aware. Laugh at the magnificent absurdity of consciousness, trying to understand consciousness. Because in that laughter, something shifts, not because you've accomplished anything, but because you've stopped trying to accomplish everything. Not because you've found the answer, but because you've seen through the question. Not because you've transcended the paradox of self-awareness, but because you've embraced it as the greatest joke ever told. And in embracing the joke, you become the punchline. In seeing the humor, you become the laughter. In recognizing the play, you become the playfulness itself. And that, perhaps, is as close to liberation as consciousness can get while still pretending to be trapped. And so here we are, at the end of our journey through the terrible paradox of self-awareness. Or perhaps I should say, here we are at the beginning, because every ending in consciousness is also a new beginning. Every conclusion an opening, every answer a deeper question. What have we discovered together? That the very thing that makes you most human, this capacity to be aware that you're aware, is also the source of every psychological suffering you've ever experienced. That consciousness, in becoming conscious of itself, creates the illusion of division where there is only unity. That the observer and the observed, the seeker and the sought, the controller and the controlled are all characters in the same impossible drama. But most importantly, we've seen that this isn't a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived. A cosmic joke to be enjoyed, rather than a spiritual goal to be achieved. A game of consciousness playing with itself, rather than a serious quest for ultimate truth. So what now? What do you do with this recognition that the very self that wants to do something with it might not actually be there? What action do you take when you've seen that there might be no actor? Nothing different, and everything different. You continue living, but with the lightness of knowing it's all a beautiful performance. You keep seeking, but with the humor of knowing that what you seek is what's seeking. You go on being self-aware, but with the freedom of knowing that the self being aware is just awareness wearing a temporary costume. The terrible paradox of self-awareness turns out to be not terrible at all, but wonderful, full of wonder, full of surprise, full of the most delicious kind of cosmic humor. Because consciousness wouldn't have gone to all this trouble to hide from itself if it wasn't planning to enjoy the game of finding itself again. So play on, awareness, continue the dance, conscious consciousness. Keep up the magnificent charade of being someone who could wake up from the dream of being someone. And remember, the joke is always on you, because you are the joke, and you are also the laughter that recognizes it. And in that recognition, perhaps something settles, not because you've solved the mystery, but because you've stopped needing it to be solved. Not because you've transcended the paradox, but because you've learned to dance with it. Not because you've escaped the terrible gift of self-awareness, but because you've discovered it was a gift all along,